Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Complexity Lounge, which is a meetup where we gather to talk about all things related to complexity and complex adaptive systems. I'm Jocko Selberg, and somewhere out there in her apartment is the multi-talented Barbara Frontera, and together we co-host the lounge. Before we kick it off today, just a few quick ground rules. We will be recording today's session, so if you don't wish to be recorded, please make sure that your camera and microphone are turned off. We also ask that you please keep the side chat activity to a minimum during the presentation. It can be a little bit distracting sometimes. After Greg's talk, we will have a question and answer period. You can either raise your hand or just send your question directly to Barbara via chat. The recordings will be posted on Vimeo on our NYC Complexity Lounge page in the next couple of days, and that is where you'll find all of our past videos from the lounge. Our guest today is Greg Brougham. Greg has a few decades of experience building and delivering complex systems. He has a decade of experience in using Cynefin and has published a short introductory book called the Cynefin Mini Book. More recently, Greg spent time as the Director of Engineering for a blockchain startup and has helped one of the leading UK telecom vendors with their digital transformation. He has an interest in architecture, human behavior, change in general, and sailing in specific. So Greg, welcome to the Complexity Lounge.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction and the opportunity to talk to the group. I'll share my screen. So just confirm, you should be able to see the slides now. And one of the things, what I want to do is talk about transformation. The title is it a thing? And we'll come back to that. And this is something I've been doing probably over the last couple of decades, quite a bit in the last 5 years. Everything's really probably been prefixed with actually digital in the title. And what I want to do is talk about it, probably there's a philosophical perspective about it, but I also want to touch on some of the practices around this. So you'll find there's a mixture actually in here. It's not theory, then practice. There's a combination of things as we actually go through this. But I wanted to ground this in Chile is principle of continuity is based on the principle of change. So I found this, I came across this only about a decade ago, but to some extent I feel it summarizes my career quite nicely. Working for one of the large consultancies a couple of decades ago. And one of the reasons I did end up doing that was I found that most organizations undertake change in an episodic manner that is infrequent. And I found that I wanted to be able to improve, change things, and therefore ended up in the consultancy paradigm. One of the amusing things out of that was actually realizing quite quickly was the consultancies are quite interested in helping their clients with change, but they're not interested in changing themselves. But the other thing about this was that organizations, they're in effectively a homeostasis. They're in a steady state, and that state is basically requires energy. I thought if we were a group, one of the things I've always wanted to actually ask the group to do is you stand up, stand on one leg and close your eyes and see how steady you actually are. The point about this was that you have to expend energy to stay there. And one of the things that if continuity is based on the principle of change, would it be interesting if organizations actually spent the energy on actually changing and not actually trying to maintain an equilibrium position? So maybe we can come back to that at the end, towards the end. So the question then comes, well, actually, how much can organizations know? And this is actually a paper Paul Ormeroyd and Bridget Rosendale published in 2004. And I think it has a couple of interesting things. They were looking back at basically a couple of meta studies done in the last century, and the two stylized facts they extracted out of that was that most firms fail early, and that there's actually only a very few firms that actually make it over 100 years old. And those are probably two common things which we'd actually state as actually being fairly obvious these days. The lean startup community or startups, it's known that most organizations fail within the first year or so. And there's very few, this is what De Hawkes was talking about, the Living Company, actually make it past 100, and there's a society for organizations like that. And I was looking at Ford and GM. Ford was actually incorporated in 1903 and GM in 1908. And of course, the only reason GM's actually here was in 2008. The US government actually bailed them out. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't exist. But the authors went beyond that. What they did is they actually developed a model which looked at how much organizations could actually know. And this was looking at actually what impact or effect their strategy would have on the market. And what they found is if the model simulated even just a little bit of knowledge, that the model basically varied from the stylized facts. And if the organization can know all information about the market, then it tended towards the classical of all organizations existing for all time, which is not. So their conclusion coming out of this was that basically companies cannot know anything about the impact of their strategy in the market. And I'd highlight, this is Pillar's ICO in 2017. And I think this is quite interesting because basically David Siebel wrote the grey paper for this. And the reason he wrote it as a grey paper was basically because he got sick of white papers at the time. And I know David for over a decade. And we've debated this point about emergence versus basically prediction over that period of time. In fact, I actually ended up paying for David to cover a cognitive edge course in New York some years ago, but it didn't change David's perspective on this. And when after this, it was around 2018, I actually asked David, had he actually foreseen this? And he actually was honest enough to admit that basically the coming together of Pillar was actually something he actually had not foreseen. In fact, what it was a combination of his book he wrote, Paul, in 2010, which is around sovereign data, a combination of crypto, in fact, ephemeral, because of the smart contract aspects of it, and a couple of guys coming out of Brazil, which actually had quite a lot of experience. So I think this was the Ibera quote, which compares occasionally. It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. And I think we could probably cross out especially, and talk about the fact that we can't actually make predictions about anything. And to some extent, this is really what the lean startup community have been arguing to some extent. But the question then comes, what can you know? And this is one of Dave's favorite quotes, some leveraging here, around direction. I'm thinking the younger. And I think there's two aspects to this. One is direction is actually fairly easily to obtain or understand for most organizations which I've been involved in. But there's also a temporal aspect to this, because basically it talks about wind and favorable conditions. And if you're racing, you turn up and you actually effectively have to deal with the conditions. And I think we'll come back to this when we talk about temporality. Most organizations don't have the luxury of sitting on the side. And I want to just compare this with Intel versus Tesla, because Intel, the perception for a long time was that they actually were had a lot of foresight basically about the rise of the microprocessor market. But what it turned out was it wasn't actually foresight. They had operational controls, and their production levels were actually controlled based on productivity. And what they actually ended up doing at the operational level was prioritizing microprocessors over memory. The Japanese were coming into the memory market, decimating their margins. And it wasn't until sometime later that the board actually endorsed that actually as a strategy. Versus basically Tesla, which has always been clear that their direction is about electrification of vehicles. And I went back and read Morris's basically story about Tesla just to see if there'd been any foresight in this. And I can't see anything actually in there. There was a clear understanding about direction. They effectively picked up the work that AC Propulsion had been doing. AC Propulsion was already using 1865 cells. It had a lightweight frame when it actually had all the automation and engine stuff. And the only thing that Tesla, I think Musk has got right, was the fact that he's tried to do this in 3 phases. He's looked at this basically in terms of going after the high value, then the medium, and then low. And that's actually probably saved them. They've had quite a few existential issues as they actually have come across through this. Because I sail, I want to talk about boundaries and bring it grounded actually in sailing. This is actually Solent, which is actually a piece of water off the south coast of the UK between South Coast and the Isle of Wight. And it's quite a challenging piece of water because it has what we refer to as a dual stand, because the water coming up the English Channel comes in from the left through the Needles, and half an hour later or so it comes in from the right through the Forts. And it makes it one of the more complicated pieces of water to actually navigate in. And this is just a chart rendered in Nick White's Expedition, which is a great piece of software if you sail. And the reason for this was, this is Roaring 40, this is Cowes 2012. This is a class 40 boat. And most 40-foot boats at that stage only had about a 2-foot draft. That is from the level, touch water to the bottom of the keel. They're about 2 meters. This thing had a 3-meter draft. So navigating this for the week led me to go back and look at the charts and actually try and understand what were the boundary conditions that actually were applicable to actually racing this boat during the week. And I also had a little bit of oversight to this because we actually had Michelle and his wife were on board, and she was pointing out that all their savings were actually in this boat. Crashing this actually during the week would not have been acceptable because it was not a canting keel, it was a fixed keel. It would have been rather expensive. And stuff happens. So this is Vesta's Wind. This is actually the Volvo in 2014. They were blast reaching in the Indian Ocean, and they ran into a reef, which did effectively rip the keel out of the back of the boat. And what I found, the incident report is quite interesting around this. There wasn't one single basically cause. It was a series of causes. It reminds me of basically Decker's drift into failure. It was a smaller series of things which actually they could have at any point and probably addressed, but because they weren't, they actually culminated in actually hitting something which they shouldn't have actually hit. And it's quite interesting when they put the boat back together and finished the last leg of the Volvo, they didn't take the navigator with them. They changed the navigator. So there is consequences to this stuff. We talked about direction briefly and boundaries. I should have pointed out was, Dave talks about negative stories in terms of boundaries, and I find those useful. But what I find the key thing really is around making sure there's alignment in the organization. And of course, this was the focus of Bungay's The Art of Action, and what I refer to as joining the dots. It's really touching on Keegan's immunity to change. He's very open about this as a one-line statement, and he talks about people don't want to change because they're afraid of dying. And what Bungay talks about this in the prefix of his book, that the CEO has basically announced a new strategy, a new direction, and the people who were leaving the meeting were actually talking about, well, actually, what does it mean for me? And the two words that sort of use is focus and positivity. The positivity aspects, what I try and do is use a micro-narrative approach to try and basically start to take them on the journey to get them to actually understand what it actually means from their perspective. And I'd have a simple approach, which is just based on Minto's pyramid method. To structure that, there's nothing, the key thing is really it's their stories and it's something they can own, and that then allows them to actually come back and start to work in the now and therefore break this down. I also give them some other tools. This is where I use A3 idealized design if there's actually major issues. One of the other things I've done with an architecture group is use the what, the why, what, how. The direction feeds into the why. We need to engage in the what, and we leave the team to actually start to understand the how. So you're creating space. What I try and avoid a lot is not to use the empowerment word in any of this. So there's a complexity informed, but basically a lot of this is about practicality around this, which leads us on to talking about temporality. And I've used time-based competition here because this is, there's a riff, although I prefer Boyd and Boyd's work. And there was the HBR paper in 1988, which George Short wrote of Boston Consulting Group, where he talked about this. The the story that Richard's actually uses actually in this was actually an example actually Stork actually wrote in the original paper. And this was about basically the Yamaha Honda's wars in the early 1980s. Basically, what happened is Yamaha said that they were actually going to become the major manufacturer. The largest manufacturer at the time was Honda. But Honda didn't actually respond by basically building larger. What it did is used a temporal approach. It actually started to actually introduce more models. And over a course of 18 months, it introduced about 3 times as many models, 113 to some Yamaha's 37. And I think the interesting thing about this was, Stark talked about it being a time-based or variety-based model, but I think it actually has relevance from a complexity point of view, because what they've done is they put the customer in the loop. So they've actually introduced it, they've taken the customer feedback, they've introduced another model, and their engineering capability enabled them to actually effectively outperform Yamaha, and Yamaha 18 months later basically publicly apologized for instigating this, since they would compete, but they would compete basically in their own remit going forward. And I touched on this earlier about the temporality issues. Most organizations don't have the luxury, I think, because they're engaged in the market, don't have the luxury of sitting on the side and waiting for things to happen. So I said, if we're navigating or sailing, if we turn up for a race, we have to race in the conditions. If you're doing a passage plan, then you have the opportunity to say when you want to engage. So if you're a company, you're introducing a new product line, you actually have that value, but most organizations don't. And at the risk of upsetting a few of my friends in the DevOps community, I would say this is largely the benefit that DevOps has actually brought to us, is the ability to do things much, much quicker. And I was amused that I actually had a friend who's leaving Google recently, and he had done the obituary blog. And he was talking around one of the 3 things he'd actually picked up from Google was the fact that they actually are very good at focusing on productivity. And I think that the ability to do things quickly gives you the flexibility to actually be competitive. And that's, George Stork was writing about this 33 decades ago, but I think this is still very important, and probably more important today than ever. Which brings us sort of onto the capability discussion around this. And I've used governing and enabling constraints because I know Alicia's taking these out for the new book. And Dave's sort of been trying to move away from them as well to talk about scaffolding. But this is the top-down, bottom-up stuff. And we have the position where you have government, you have standard policies, standards, etc., basically constraining an organization. Enabling is basically about bottom-up. You're doing something new that then enables you to have discussion that moves the organization or moves the system to a new stable state, and you continue again. And what I try and do with this is not to attack the policies and standards, but trying to actually start from a bottom-up approach and make it evidence-based. So explore what would actually make sense for the organization. And once we've evidenced that, then that actually enables us to have the governing discussions and change the policies. And therefore, you move the organization forward in step. A couple of examples recently, these don't need to be large initiatives. We took a pipeline had been built for one organization for the front end. We added a UI kit on the left. We added we introduced serverless on the right to support Canary deployments. That enabled the front-end teams basically to be able to do a Git clone and actually do a hello world in 10 minutes. That is, they could literally log on, clone the repo, write some code, push the button, and within 10 minutes would actually be deployed into the staging environments. We did something similar on the service on the back end. That was a Kubernetes Istio overlay. Istio to enable us to actually have Canary developments, Canary support. That was a much larger investment in time and effort. And that stuff, but it was the key thing was it was really based on the context. It was what actually made sense for them. I see some people now starting to push back on the Kubernetics discussion. And I would argue that that's probably appropriate given different contexts. And I want to touch on briefly on planning before we talk about pillars. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole here. All I really want to flag is the fact that if you're doing this and you're starting to become, you can make changes quickly, then you can actually start moving forward in an incremental fashion. And you can move away from a large, so the paradigm would be basically what you're doing is you're effectively taking the large ship. You know, there's always been talk around the fact that moving organizations is like sort of trying to nudge a large ship. If we can cut the ship up actually into sections, and we can move the individual components, then we can actually have much more flexibility in this. But you know, the key thing about this is most organizations, if they're listed, still actually have a requirement to actually report on a quarterly and annual basis. So there's a temporal aspect that comes into this actually as well, and the need to actually have feedback mechanisms embedded in that. And there's a Lucille quote I've just put in here. It's around the direction. If you can't change it, then you may actually end up where you're heading. So there's direction is fine, but you need to be able to assess this stuff dynamically. And I think a lot of large transformation programs I've been involved in where you've been spending large amounts of money, you end up with basically an end state model, which is focused on an outcome or a thing which actually misses the outcome. I think there is a much more evolutionary approach that actually would have benefit from a transformation perspective. And this is the bit around engagement. And this, from a Boyd perspective, this is the observe orientate bit that I use when if I'm asked to look at a piece of work. It's around the structure, approach, and people. And to me, structure is really about architecture. It is largely my background. And the two things I look for in terms of basically programs or initiatives is really around what I refer to as coherence and congruence. Coherence is basically, does it actually, the architecture actually have coherence? Does it actually make sense? I remember doing one large piece of work where what we ended up with was the inputs were actually coming in for, it's a card settlement system. The input was actually files, but the client lead wanted to actually have an event-driven system. It wasn't going to go very well, and it didn't go very well. It took months actually to take it apart and put it back together and to provide some degree of coherency to the architecture. And similarly, the congruence is basically looking at the architecture and saying, will this actually support the organization direction around this? There's two other things I really want to just touch on here was modularity and interfaces. I think what we've seen over the last decade or so is a move away from large monolithic stacks to microservices, and we're starting to see actually move back towards sort of some degree of modularization of this. And I like if you look at any of Sandy Rowe's breakdowns of Tesla's, he's talked around how the fact that he thinks Tesla got it right because they went to a die stamping basically for the rear of for the Series 3. And they've continued to actually do that. They've got the modularity right, which enables them to actually have flexibility around this. And I see a lot from a technical perspective in Uber's domain-oriented microservices, that you don't need to actually have everything doesn't need to be a microservice, and it certainly shouldn't actually be a monolith. A great example would be, I remember going to a presentation some years ago, Lean Cataban in hotels.com talking about the fact that they were struggling with their monolith and actually needed to change it. Their initiative was not to effectively completely re-architect it, that the answer for them was 4. To split the monolith into 4 gave them the organizational flexibility they needed to do. And once you've actually got those interfaces, then we can start talking about APIs or an API first based approach. And this is where I like Alicia's concept of sloppiness comes into bear. Because I'm old enough to remember Postel's law, and Postel's law was key to effectively the effectiveness of the command line utilities, Unix. it talks about the fact that your output should be highly constrained, but your input should be flexible. You know, and I think this is a classic example of the sloppiness, and that actually enables you to have the flexibility in the architecture. So if I have the opportunity with teams, I try and sort of encourage them to actually think about what's the right modularity for them and what's the right degree of sloppiness. Approach, I'm not going to dwell on this. I think, you know, the article I co-wrote with John Husband recently, we talked about everything, most organizations having some form of agile these days. But I think the disappointing thing about this was that most organizations may claim to be agile, but they're not agile as organizations. And to the point we were touching on earlier, Jocko, is I think emergence is probably understood, but it actually has value if you, and that was something I sort of explored in the InfoQ paper a couple of months ago. But I think there's two things that, other things I really want to touch on here was what I do see around most organizations is good coming together, having the concept of stand up. You know, if you look at Crystal's work around a team of teams, it was the key thing, and it was the thing that Chris Fuller's picked up and took forward in the One Mission. And something I picked up from Nigel Thurlow, the concept of a meta Scrum. You know, I'm not a great fan of Scrum, but you know, if the practices actually make sense, take value out of them. But I don't see most organizations actually understanding this. You know, they mostly try and constrain this at the team level and don't actually look at effectively at the portfolio or the actual organizational level. And therefore, most organizations don't get the benefit of actually being agile. I think, again, you know, if you look at some of the Joe Justice's talks around Tesla, I think they've actually got some of the things quite right. The other thing I wanted to touch on was what I've started to see as a trend is, and what I would refer to as the fetishization of failure. And this is actually, Amy, if you might be aware, Amy Edison's writing a new book, and it's the right kind of wrong. You know, what she's providing is an ontological framework to actually talk about failure. And I think a lot of what I've started to see is people basically saying failure is actually, you know, okay, and that's fine. But they're actually starting to do it outside what I refer to as the scientific method, or going back to Karl Popper. You know, his point was really around its falsification of a hypothesis. It's not failure for the sake of failure. And what I do like, actually, John Husband has this phrase, champion and channel. I think that's actually quite useful to explore that in some times as well. Which brings me on to the people thing. And one of the things I'm very adamant these days is teams are primary. You may argue that, but I think, you know, if you go back and look at even things like Johnson's writing on Edison, you know, everyone would say Edison was the innovator. Edison actually had a team referred to as the muckers. They were the guys who actually made it work. Yeah. So this, you know, but what I see is not a lot of organizations understanding that. They still actually try and, you know, the HR departments, to my mind, are actually a huge constraint of most organizations, because they'll effectively support the organization hiring people, but they won't actually give the primacy back to the team. I actually ended up got seconded into a line role for one of the retail banks, and ended up running a team of about 30 payments architects some years ago. And one of the problems we actually had was that we were getting these starky emails every month, basically from the CIO, from the project managers, about your architects basically don't know what they're doing and they're not collaborative. And, you know, and I looked at the process and said, well, you know, how do you actually hire these guys? And they said, well, we do a competency interview. And I said, that's fine. But what I want to do is I'll add an SME interview, which I'll conduct to make sure they actually can do more than spell payments. But the thing we're going to do is we're going to give the CIO, the PMs, actually a veto over placement of the architects. And actually, over the course of about 3 months, they actually only vetoed one architect. But the thing is, we gave them agency. And the other thing I did was basically, I also made sure that we cleared the decks of people who I deemed were not actually incompetent, particularly competent. You know, if they're coming up to the end of the contract, we just basically rolled them off. And what we found was those emails, psyche emails, stopped after about a month or so. And then about 3 months later, we had this email come through. It says, this guy, Mike, he's great. He's wonderful. He's one of the best people we've actually had. He's adding great value as an architect to the team. I think there's different approaches you can take, but I think teams do actually need. And I find Matt Scoutman's work on team topology quite nice because it just gives you a simple orthonological framework to actually deal with teams. It just has 4 because not all teams are the same. And it enables you to actually understand how you can put these together. And Matt's really open about this, was the fact that that's a starter for 10 and you can start to tweak it. And we touched on this in the article I wrote with John Husband was, it's the classic Drucker quote, was that in a knowledge environment, the workers know more. So why can't you actually trust them? The COVID paper actually went in more around why the drivers around the Great Resignation, which I'll leave in a moment. And there's 2 other things I just want to touch on is the heterogeneous and homogeneity. I don't see this as a versus, I see this as an and. And if I'm running an engineering group, I try and give the team actually the flexibility around the tooling. And this is really the challenge I see with most large organizations. They still have a purchasing department. The purchasing department think their function is actually to drive these things. I don't. If you're giving the primacy back to the teams, you need to give them the flexibility. I see this is where open source actually has a huge amount of utility because you can actually get the teams actually to do the work. You don't run an individual RFI, let the teams actually download, play with the tools and see what actually has utility in their context. And you harmonize where it actually makes sense. So it becomes a more flexible, not one size fits all model. The other thing is, if you purchasing want to have a role in this and you're not comfortable with open source, having validated that, then you can move towards a SaaS-based model. And I've seen numerous organizations do that now. They want to move to a non-SQL database. They don't actually want to deploy it because these days, so you enter into a service agreement. So you actually have the flexibility over that. And that's something you can actually distract the purchasing department with. And dependencies and cognition. You're probably aware Jim Brenson has a great talk on dependencies, and Jim's always great to listen to and engage. Now, he sees dependencies between teams as an opportunity, basically, for collaboration, and I think that's great, where you can actually drive it. I tend to effectively look at sort of Santola's work on this area and sort of take it more from a complexity perspective. I touched on around interfaces and sloppiness before. One of the things we were doing was that we were starting to standardize and utilize an API-driven first approach. We actually had some tooling, we validated that in the team, and then we built the bridges. So it's a case of when we actually need an interface, what we did is we actually supported that group coming onto the tooling to enable us to actually have this flexibility. And it also enables us to actually have this conversation about what degree of sloppiness actually is appropriate here. And this is one of the things I think a lot of organizations have got wrong around the API first, is they built it, they put it into an open API framework, they push it out. And then they actually start complaining about why things actually break and why there's a huge degree of basically challenges around this. One of the things I sort of talked about just on the homogeneity issue and heterogeneity. One I mentioned before, we recent engagement, we built a K8 fabric. And one of the things that actually transpired was we actually had two groups doing this. And we didn't actually stop it. What I did is I took advantage of the fact that they were fairly siloed in the organization and the management wasn't actually overly engaged, and let them actually do it, because it created actually a degree of learning opportunity for the organization. So that was a very quick talk about transformation and some of the practicalities of it. But coming back to the earlier question, I think what I'd like to touch on is the Cartesian duality. I think at the moment when most organizations think about transformation, they think about there's a difference between basically the thinking and the doing. And I think why that duality continues to exist, transformation will be a thing we do. It's not something we are. And I was at the Systems Innovation Conference in London last week, at the end of the week, and Stephen Gray was talking around. And if you, Barbara has met Stephen and Dave has as well. His work is actually in reconciliation and peace. And I thought some of the stuff was actually really upbeat, but I don't want to close on that. What I want to do is talk about what to feed into the conversation. What do you think would actually need to be true to move that, to address this duality and move it from a being to something we actually do? Because my hope out of this was that utilizing complexity formed approaches, what we can do is we can actually move this more to a journey, not an end state, away from end state models. And therefore it's something we can actually enjoy doing. And there I'd like to leave it.
Well, that was awesome. Thank you, Greg. So now we'll move into the question and answer section and hopefully the conversation section as well. But if you have a question, please raise your little virtual hand, or you can put it in the chat with either a Q at the beginning so I recognize it as a question, or directed directly to me. I've put a lot of links. Alicia and I have put a lot of links in the chat for the various things that Greg referenced during his talk. So if you have any questions about that, and I encourage you to ask questions, because otherwise I'll start asking questions, and I don't think any of you want that. So, any questions?
Hi, I've got one if I'm allowed.
Well, you didn't raise your virtual hand, but I will let you proceed. Yes.
So, Greg, thank you for that. That was a brilliant talk. And one thing that I kind of picked up, and I'd kind of thought, and I really want to hear your view, because you're a sailor and you're into complexity. Well, my understanding with sailing is that you cannot steer and you cannot change direction if you're not moving. Basically, if you're not making headway through the water, you've got no way of moving. And I think the way you were saying about you need to do small things, I think the way I see a lot of these organizational transformations is people are trying to move the whole thing all at once. They're like trying to be the tide and move everything. Whereas I like your thing about you do the small thing to move. But is there something in there about, from a complexity perspective, as someone who's sat on the Solent for many hours staring at the water, has this connection ever been made about the movement and the stagnancy and being able to steer?
I would come back from a slightly different perspective, Chris, talk about VMG, velocity made good, and targets. Mm-hmm. What we tend to do as the navigators these days, we don't give VMG, velocity made good, which is actually effectively to the helms. We actually try and give the boat, the trimmers, the targets, the numbers to steer to, because what we're doing is we're moving them into the now. Because you can gamify the VMG, you can't necessarily what you're trying to do is bring them into the present and get them to actually control what they can control. So to your point about steering, well, actually what we're trying to do with that is we're actually trying to make the small gains. Mm-hmm. And what we do is with Nick's software, what I can do is I can actually give the individual trimmers actually the targets and the percentage targets of boat speed against that. And they can actually then play to see if they can actually move it up. The other thing I would touch on in terms of sailing, if you're putting a boat together, it takes us about 2 years to get a team to be really effective, because it's not just about the team, it's about the boat. The boat's part of the ecosystem. And what we have to do is we actually have to develop the polars for the boat and develop an understanding about what actually makes sense in terms of numbers.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we have, Steve has asked for some clarification. I think whose law was highly constrained output and highly flexible input?
Oh, Postul's law, P-O-S-T-E-R.
Okay.
On Wikipedia.
Okay, great. Okay, and then Aidan asked a question, and then we'll get to Andrew, who's just raised his hand. But Aidan O'Brien has asked, shouldn't we be looking for high leverage point, think rudders in a sailing context, rather than trying to control and change everything?
It was just a riff on Chris's point.
Oh, I see. Okay, it wasn't an actual question. Okay.
It was just to say, is that true or not? Is that how you should think about it? Because I thought it was a very good, very valid point from Chris saying that, people seem to try in organizations to change everything at the same time when that seems unrealistic. In a natural fashion, we're looking for those, high leverage points within an organization.
I think that's still, I was trying to come at this from a complexity emergent perspective. And what we talk about is what I try and focus on is small changes. The example I talked about was basically with payment architects, it was actually a small change to actually give rise to something like that. And it's coming back to the fact that we can't necessarily control or actually understand the outcome of this. So if you've done it before and you actually understand the leverage points, certainly. But if you're coming from this and you're actually in an open system, the agents in the system co-evolve. It says, well, what actually may have worked over here possibly doesn't work in this context, and you have to actually take a more experimental hypothesis-based approach to it.
So do you have any guidance there? So every small change is not equal, I would assume. So how then, sort of in a context where you don't know, how do you prioritize between different potential small changes when you're trying to actually devise those hypotheses? Is there any guidance on that or not?
I would tend to try and do that by sort of do a contextualization process around, utilize Cynefin, try and understand which domain those points actually sit in, therefore, how would you actually approach it? Because if it's simple, you've done it before, it's clear, it's obvious. If you think it's complicated and someone's done it before, you can just do the analysis, and it's really where it's truly complex, then you take a more hypothesis-based approach to it.
Okay, got it.
The key point is, it's not one size fits all. It's all you have to be very contextually based around this stuff.
Okay, makes sense.
Great. Andrew.
Hello. So I'm gonna build on something that Chris was talking about, and also something that I know Dave's been working on quite a bit, and also tie it into sailing. So I'm not a sailor, but I'm going to use some terminology. Feel free to correct me. And I'm interested in tacking specifically, and I'm interested in tacking in relation to energy potentials, because I've gotten really into this idea of mapping kind of the topology of change and looking at it as energy functions. And thinking about sailing and thinking about climbing an energy potential when you get those zigzag roads kind of going up the mountain. And I was looking for just building a little bit onto those concepts together in relation to how you understand sailing and organizational change.
From a sailing perspective, basically, you look at what I talked about earlier was the boundaries, those great. But obviously, if you're going towards basically a certain mark, basically what you're looking at for what we talked about as a cone, we don't really want to be going outside that. It actually provides a much more constrained view based on the wind, and what we're looking for is basically wind shifts, which actually would bias us, and what the propensity, is there actually any patterns we can discern on the day? It's not, I wouldn't see it as an energy potential question. What we try and do is you're trying to minimize the energy loss during attack, but invariably you will lose. And typically there's sort of certain techniques we use to try and maintain the boat momentum. You try and let the boat turn itself. You don't try and force the boat, etc. You may be able to draw some stuff out of that. And just by the way, I noticed Dave sort of talked about the parallel safety fouls, which if you're in complex, it's not about a single hypothesis, there's multiple things. It comes back to as if there's any coherency to those, then let's explore them. So, and Andrew, was it sufficient, or would you like to elaborate, delve further?
Yeah, it was a topic for exploration. I just saw the parallels there, and it seems like, with some of the speakers that we've had, like we've done a lot with sailing, and so it seems like a very apt approach to understanding these systems.
I think, Greg, if I could jump in, I think there's one other thing from complexity that I'd add in that with that metaphor is it's about obliquity. The fact that sometimes going straight for the mark is not the most effective way, but sometimes you have to take an oblique course. So I think it's going the obvious path, which is let's just point the boat at the mark. If the wind's blowing towards you, you're not going to get there, and sometimes you have to do that oblique thing. So Greg, if you thought of it from that perspective, what's your experience with that obliquity, that oblique kind of concept to dealing with the complex system?
Certainly from a sailing perspective, you can't sail directly up to a mark. You're tacking, as Andrew's highlighted. But the point around obliquity or non-direct motion comes into account when you're going downwind, because basically what you're looking for is actually maximizing the target velocity of the boat. So you may be sailing a higher angle because that's actually what the characteristics of the organization. And I think this comes back to the oblique element I see in this is the capability of the teams and the organization. If you haven't built that capability up, you're not going to be able to actually do some of this stuff. So there's the capability to be able to maneuver the boat, and there's also the capability to actually understand what would actually be the most appropriate in this context. Because I've talked about this mostly from an emergent complexity perspective, but as David pointed out, is if you're in a simple ordered space and you know what actually it is, therefore you can actually plan the actions. And that's one of the things I've always liked about Cynefin is the context, bounded applicability. It's not everything's complex. Some things are complicated, some things are simple. You need to actually understand and have that ability to determine where you are, what's the context, and therefore how would you actually act on this stuff.
I think you said something really interesting there, which is it's about the teams, because my experience is that real people who understand Agile and kind of improving organizations like this focus on building good teams, and then the organization of those teams is emergent, knowing that there are certain problems we need to solve for. We know the problems we need to solve for, but it's emergent according to the teams. Whereas it seems that the Agile sales organization now is all about organizing teams, even though the teams don't know what they're doing. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that thing that you mentioned. It's about the teams.
Well, I was going to throw it back to your needs versus solutions discussion, Chris. But you're right, and that's really what I was trying to get out of underneath this was the fact it is very much around the organizational need and the context of what the organization wants to do and achieve. And I said it's really a lot of the time I find I spend time is really around the alignment question. It's basically what would actually make sense for this team or this department to actually do in the context of the direction the organization wants to do.
So it's understanding the needs rather than just forcing a standard solution upon every organization. So you get it to work at ING Bank, well, actually someone else got it to work at ING Bank. You then claim the credit for it, and therefore every bank in the world should work in that particular way.
Yes, so one of the things I was going to say at the start was basically I'm not looking to run off and write a book around transformation, because I think that's in itself is actually a paradoxical statement. How can you write something which you can write about an experience, but that experience does not necessarily translate to another organization? I think the best I've seen is what Scott Amell has done with DoD. What he's done is he's given you the options and you can choose the appropriate techniques or tools actually in your context. And the skill becomes actually, understanding what tools or practices actually have relevance in your context. I've just touched on a few, in what we're talking about today. But I think the value is you have a rich and large toolkit, and you bring the relevant practices to bear based on the context and the need.
It's worth noting, though, isn't it, that, I mean, Scott, when he was doing that in the purest sense, almost went under and almost went bankrupt. And he's now sort of kind of like going over to the dark side to endorse PMI's attempt to compete with Scrum and Safe. Yeah. And he's even caught up with the requisite agility nonsense. So I think that there's something about the wider ecosystem here, and the whole Agile community keeps looking for a silver bullet. And Teams is no more a silver bullet than the mindset nonsense. Yeah, what you've got is a highly complex ecosystem, and you need to understand what that ecosystem is and where you've got stabilities, where you haven't got stabilities, where you need them, where you don't. And the interventions will be radically different in different contexts, even within one company. Yeah.
I agree. I talked about Teams as being primacy because I think it's something it makes sense. I notice your comment on LinkedIn is really about this mantra of moving from hierarchical to sort of network, and I would reference Fairlow stuff. No, it's hierarchy, network, heterarchy, and autonomous organizations, autonomous. And I feel a lot of organizations have actually gone down because they're agile. They think every team actually has to be self-determining and self-organizing, and I think that is another fallacy which doesn't hold up. Some teams or some people actually require more structure overlaid. The other thing that's just touching on sort of some of the practices around what I've realized, anything that's got big in it is quite frankly crap. You know, having gone through big room planning with a couple of organizations, it is no more agile than traditional waterfall, quite frankly. You know, and I've seen this with teams go through that process. It's the fact that you're trying to basically come up with something which has coherence, or you think would actually have coherence for 3 months. And the reality is what you find a week or two after that is you're having people asking and going, well, actually, we made certain assumptions are no longer valid. You know, everything we committed to is not going to happen.
And that's something we found at Skype. We start the first time we did kind of like that portfolio level planning at Skype, we assumed we needed a plan, and we spend a lot of the time was the discussion about how we are actually going to go about delivering things over the quarter. And as we evolved, what we discovered is actually what we need is something you mentioned, Greg, which is we needed alignment. So the conversation shifted at the portfolio level away from a plan to here's the priority, here's the order in which the organization would like to see these things done, so that if you have a choice between doing that piece of work or this piece of work, you do this piece of work. But we realized that the planning itself wasn't that important. Not only that, because we hadn't invested so much into that complicated planning structure, and we got a very simple, easy to articulate order, a backlog, we found it was really easy when new things came in, and quite often those new things coming in came in at the top of the list. But because everyone knew what the organization, the ordered list was, when something new came up, everyone else could adapt around that. And that's where my view of that scaling thing is not so much here's a set of solutions, so much as, or here's a fixed solution. There's only one way to do safe, or spotty safe as it's now called. Instead, it's here's the problems that you need to solve in your order. So let's clearly state the problem as a constraint for you to solve. And different organizations have different problems, different needs. But the statement of the problem, and then letting those those organizations come together, and then you're going to see patterns emerge. So you're going to see some of the problems that you see you'll have experienced before. So they're more on the complicated domain, and some of them are going to be more exploratory. So they're going to be in the multiple safe to fail kind of space to solve.
If you're implementing safe, you're demasted on a lee shore in a major storm, right? To pursue the sailing metaphor, right? I think you're trying to sail a boat in a volcano. Yeah, I'm something I've been knocking my head against, which interesting the military gets. So I'm working on Futurist C2 Command at the moment in UK, US, and Sweden. And we're talking now about distributed decision-making, not delegated decision-making. And that's that's something it's almost impossible to get agile people to understand. They're really stuck in the concept of delegation. They don't understand distribution. So I think that there's a body of key phrases and key words we need to start to get across to people in terms of the way this is going to pan out.
I'd be interested to see that statement. If you said the community solutions in Agile, I would completely agree. I think the community of needs, the thing about the community of needs, most people don't know who they are. They're a very loosely, they're not so prominent now.
They're also still stuck in a manufacturing concept. I mean, they still want users to tell them what to deliver. And they haven't understood that technology needs to be co-evolutionary with unarticulated user needs. So there's a whole body of stuff around this that people have got to think about in fairly different ways.
Okay, and Dave, I see that someone asked, is there a blog post anywhere on distributed versus delegated? Yeah.
It's going out this weekend. And at the moment, I'm attacking mindsets and adult maturity models. So I've got that on mine.
All right, I just want to make sure we keep track of and there are
vertical bloody development, which is even worse than adult maturity models.
There are some hands raised, and I just want to say before I call on Alicia that everything I know about sailing, I learned from reading the Odyssey. So I've had to be furiously Googling.
That is Swallows and Amazons, Barbara. Swallows and Amazons is much better than the Odyssey.
You showed me, you put up the map, and I was like, is this like a Scylla and Charybdis moment? What's happening here? Is this like getting blown off course to the island of Circe? What's happening? So now the next hand up is Alicia.
Greg, thanks. That was very interesting. Very interesting remarks. I'd like to ask something. I'd like you to say more about temporality. And I think this ties in with the comments that Chris just made. And that is, you spoke about temporality as time-based competition, and you used the Toyota example. You talked about the ability to do things quickly and an investment in time for another example you gave. You also mentioned feedback, and it's a separate question about whether feedback is always time-based, which I think it is. But bringing back to Chris's question, when I think of complex dynamical and complex adaptive systems, I think of context-dependent and path-dependent systems, which means that time, what happened before, this is Chris's order, the order in which things happen or happened already will change the potential, the possibility, the enabling, and the constitutive constraints of what will happen next. So could you say something more about temporality? Not just in, is it quicker, or are you spending more time on it, but that kind of temporality in complex systems?
You've touched on, I glossed over this a little bit. The key thing was you're trying to do something, give them the capability which opens up the option space to some extent. If you do it quickly, I can codify it and I can scale it, then you've opened that up. And I alluded to the fact that when we're doing some of the service stuff at the back end, that was actually a much longer time and investment. It was measured in millions, and that was not in single months. And that constrained the ability of the organization. So the fact is, until we actually got that actually up and running, we weren't able to do certain things, and therefore we actually had, to be frank, a lot of challenges. And once we actually got that up and actually running, it actually then opened up a lot of other options around this. But ideally, you want to be able to do things very, very quickly. I want to take a more trial-based approach and validate the small steps to enable us to sort of, to my mind, is actually bring the customer into the loop as much as possible. Now, I think that's where, just to touch on Lean Startup, I got it right, which has Steve Blank's stuff about get out of the office if you don't involve the customer in this. It shouldn't really be the PM's or the product owner's view, basically, what you need. It should actually, you're validating this back against the actual customer. And that actually means you've actually got to have a way of getting it actually out the door, not just in the trial sense.
If I may follow up, I still think that it's a different issue about whether you spend more time or you do it faster than because you took step A, that opened up or closed off step B or C. And then if you take step B, it opens up step D and step E. And if you do it in a different order, you get an entirely different result.
Yep.
And so it's path dependent in the sense of sequence or order or indexicality in that sense.
It is, because I said we're in
I think
one
it's very
engagement.
ignored. I think nobody pays attention to that much.
No, it's actually very relevant, because one instance we could actually get the front end stuff working quite well. The back end stuff actually took much longer, and that actually then distorted the delivery a little bit, and that determined basically how we actually we ended up going to market around some of the stuff.
But was it because the early stuff was hindering the later stuff?
There was some path dependencies around that. If we'd been,
that's what I'm really interested in.
If we'd been able to achieve the original timescales, it would have actually created a different path sequence, and we actually had to effectively do some other things.
It's related to timing, so
It
that
is.
timing does not impart energy any more than you would already have. And the example of that, of course, is the standard playground swing, right? The kick, it imparts the energy, but when you time the kick is as important as the amount of energy you transmit in the kick. And that's the sort. Nobody understands, for example, the 17-year cicadas, what kind of temporality enabling and governing constraints are going on in that ecosystem, that these animals understand 17 years, no more, no less. And it is partly geographical, but there are several broods that might coexist in the same geographic area, but the 17-year larvae will come out every 17 years, but the others, which live half a block away, do not come out except in their own temporal timing kind of phenomenon. And I think this is as important in organizations as it is in ecosystems, and it's not very well understood at all.
No, just to build on that, there were certain downstream systems which we couldn't influence, and we just had to accept the constraints. And you typically find that. I talked about sloppiness as a practice around standardization of the APIs, but sometimes you just can't move them. Personally, what I see is if you're doing card systems, you have PCI standards, PSI, DSS. And I feel they're actually over-constrained the solution, and there is actually a better way of doing this. And quite frankly, I'd like to at some stage have the opportunity to rip PCI up and just throw it in the bin and do something completely different.
If it's possible, could I add, I think, Alicia, I think there's something really interesting you said about that temporality of the questions. So taking a different slant to what Greg's talked about, I think one of the things that Agile has really improved over Waterfall is that in Waterfall, what would happen is the analysts and the architects would come up with a model for the system, and that model would then be the interface used to drive the development by the developers. What Agile has done is it's allowed the analysts and the architects to operate at a different pace with their model, and the interface isn't the actual model that forms the interface, it's examples that drive the evolution of the system. And so that has stabilized the interface between the architects and the analysts. So what it means is basically the interface becomes a list of examples that needed to be coded for, and the development team can take them along from their backlog as they go along. Whereas traditionally in Waterfall, what would happen is we'd always have this disconnect and this struggle between the two systems of thinking, the analysts kind of thinking about the future system and the actuality of the current system, because they were trying to use the model as the interface to communicate between the two systems. And I know with your big brain, and I can see the look on your face, Greg, you've got an opinion on that statement.
I think I'd come back to Aidan's comment. You know, he's put one in there around basically roadmaps and negotiated commitments between the business and the development groups. The key point is it's around the commitments. You've made a point in time commitment to do something. And really what I'm touching on was the fact that, you know, I alluded to emergence really is, I think, is an underappreciated concept and not very well understood or leveraged by development groups or organizations. And this is going back to the lean startup. It's not necessarily about what you think actually is relevant now. It's what is relevant to the customer, going back to your, you know, the needs versus solution stuff. And you need to be able to validate this. And ideally what you want, you know, this is what Tachiono 101 stuff, is you really want to be able to actually meet the customer needs and continue to meet needs, which drives that emergent. As soon as you come back to a point of commitment, negotiated commitment, you're actually taking a point in time. And that actually has implicit assumptions in it. And, you know, to your point is, you know, most people don't then actually understand how to validate those assumptions effectively get left. And the end result is basically when you go to market, you've delivered it, you've achieved what you think is your outcome. But the question then comes, actually, what was the question? What did the client actually want, or the customer need?
Can I just riff on something that Alicia said about sort of temporality? And what I'm curious to know is that does complexity theory say anything about sort of ethical questions and unexpected sort of negative externalities, things that come later down the line? So the obvious example is, social media sort of platforms developed really quickly. They evolved, they responded to what was the client need, but it's only 20 years later that we've seen that they've actually screwed mental health for society at large, and sort of those negative externalities sort of only appeared much later. So how is that managed at all, if at all, and does that make sense?
I'm looking at Dave on this one.
Question was to Alicia. I think I'll say something and Alicia can correct me. I think one of the big things, the only thing we know for certain about CAS is that you get unintended consequences. So the ethical consequence of that is that you are responsible for the unintended consequences of your actions. And that has major implications for government and industry alike. And it's one of the things some of us are trying to put across at government level. If you know this system is complex, whatever you do, the only thing you can guarantee is something unexpected would happen. So you have to get ready for that. And if you don't do that, it's your ethical responsibility.
But there's no framework. Over time, the context changed.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, but there's no framework today which actually allows people to think about how are unexpected negative externalities structured, and how should you think about them preemptively?
There's some really interesting stuff in some of the new materialist philosophers on this, not just Yolanda, but some of the feminists coming from that background.
Okay.
We're starting to look at some of the ethical implications, and I'm just starting to struggle to get my mind around some of it. Yeah, but there is some interesting new work going on there.
So I was going to say two things off the back of that, Aidan. One is, because what I talked to Joko and Barbara about was maybe a talk on identity and belonging. And the key thing about this was identity. There is actually a need for privacy. Not everything should be public, and not everything should be private. And therefore, basically, that starts to give you some way of actually thinking about this. It's not necessarily an answer, but it shouldn't be that everything you actually put on Facebook is necessarily open to everything. There should be probably more granular controls around that. And come back to the point around feedback. It shouldn't be the fact that someone's gone out and actually committed suicide. We should actually have better sensing mechanisms to enable us to actually understand, is this actually having negative impact? But I think we don't really have any way of doing that at the moment. All we actually hear is we have the negative stories, and the typical thing is we must slap more governance on them. Well, the answer is probably not more governance, because all that's doing is codifying that behavior to a certain extent.
There's a part of me that thinks there's that dual clock speed of technology versus governance.
Yes.
It's actually, which is a necessary evil that those two clock speeds aren't the same. And I don't think we can bring the two of them into sync, in any type of immediacy. But that's what I haven't sort of worked out yet. So I haven't worked out.
A couple of our team are looking at the anthropology of time. So there's actually a body of literature in anthropology about time and the way in which it impacts on culture and society. So I think there's areas of exploration on this at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, because I go back to Greg, something you said in the article you wrote with John, and you use that word hesitancy, which is another dimension of this, right? Like we have clock time, we have technological time, but then we have this very human, hesitancy. And, because that's what happens in a lot of transformations, right? We go, and then we come to a point and everyone hesitates. And so then the question becomes, is the work we've done to get to this point all in vain, or have we made progress through the transformation process? And by the way, I hate the word transformation, but we'll leave that for another day. Gives me the willies.
No, the way I think about hesitancy is, this is the potential validation. You don't go and basically turn this on and give it to everyone. You try and do this in small steps.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a large advantage we've got out of not a canary deployment. It's not only the fact that we can do this and revert, therefore it gives us flexibility, the organization flexibility. But the fact is, what we can do is we can try things out. And if they have utility, then you can actually scale them up. If they actually have, and this is the point, is if we can detect that they actually have negative consequences, then we can actually take them back out of the system. This is the classic stuff that Dave talks about with Cynefin, is that, you look at multiple hypotheses. If they have utility, you scale them. If not, you dampen them. And I think that's hesitancy is really about, actually, how do we validate this, and how do we actually dampen something if we think, what we're starting to see is negative consequences.
Yeah, and it has to do with that small safe to fail experiment idea, as opposed to the big bet, right? All of the work, and then we get to the point, and then the cost of hesitancy is very high.
Yeah, but the point about this is, we're humans basically are very, very flexible. You've seen this with Toyota putting humans back onto the line. You've seen this with Musk basically admitting that with the Type Series 3 production, trying to automate everything didn't actually make sense. They've actually taken automation out. We've put humans back into this. But the problem is, and this is really, I think what's come out of COVID, is we are flexible, but we also basically break at undisclosed points, and it becomes catastrophic. And we don't have very good mechanisms for actually understanding where you are on that. A lot of people talk about burnout, stuff like that. I think there's a lot more stuff around mental health that we actually probably should be doing.
I think that's true all the time, always. But, Jocko, I have two things. Jocko has a question. And also, before we go to Jocko, Parag, I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name. You patiently had your hand up for a really long time, and then you lowered it because I thought, well, he's just given up.
No, and thank you for all this conversation. I just wanted to contribute, but that point may have left. But I'll just go ahead and say that in my experience, transformation necessarily means doing things radically differently, and something that's, is not too traditional. And, the best way I have found things work in transformation, or transformations become successful, is when we measure them by outcomes. And then in between, how you go from point A to point B, there are so many different paths people can take, and they can use Agile, they can use Six Sigma, they can use, I don't know if some of you are scientists or engineers, you may have used TRIZ. And I mean, I think the moment if you are in a leadership capacity and trying to tell people to do only certain way, I think that's where the friction really comes in, because the subject matter expertise really lies with the people who actually do it. But if you are a leader trying to tell people to transform, and then forcing them to use Six Sigma or Agile or anything else, that's where I have found it really kind of, you get pushback.
Okay.
I would say, quite frankly, if you're using Six Sigma in a human context, you're doing something fundamentally wrong. and this is going back to you applying a mechanical model. It comes back to Alicia's point about sloppiness. Humans have ecosystems actually benefit from having a degree of sloppiness. If you try and apply Six Sigma to that, or statistical process control, it has utility in the process element, but not in the human space.
Yes.
And the class, I saw that with one of the retail banks in the UK. They tried to do the Six Sigma stuff, and they ended up about 3 or 4 layers just ripping it out, because what they'd found is internally they had SLAs, and they were meeting the SLAs. When they went back, their achievement was around about 96% on the SLA. When they went back and talked to the customers, only about a third of the customers were happy. So they ripped their Six Sigma stuff up and threw it out the door and said, the mantra is today's work today. They cross-trained the teams, and they actually tried to basically take it very much back to the customer focus. I think I just want to come back to the mental health aspect, and this is one of Dave, one of the reasons why I think teams actually have a degree of primacy, is that if the team can become the unit, they basically can look after themselves. And that's why I feel I get so frustrated about the engineering departments hired an engineer or developer. The product owners have hired, you can actually have this individual. It should be the fact that the teams actually own their own direction and their own governance around this, and should have a right of veto. I know you're doing that. It's Elliot Jack's 101 stuff. Without going there too much, I didn't want to go down that route.
Now, I really hurt Jocko's feelings by interrupting him before. So Jocko has a question.
I don't have any feelings, Barbara. I was curious. I wanted to bring it back to the temporality that Alicia was talking about, but from a different angle a little bit. One of the things in these transformations that comes up very strongly, especially at scale, is transparency.
Yes.
It has come up in terms of what do you make transparent, what don't you, but also in terms of the temporality is when do you make things transparent and when do you choose not to, because the order that you do that in is going to change the results of exactly what frames that ecosystem. So I was wondering if you could address that a little bit.
This is how you play the game, Jacko, to be frank. So what I found works quite well, and this is what Bungay talked about in the art of action, is you work 3 levels away from the board. You don't really want, and I remember seeing this in one of the banks, senior manager I'd been doing some work for didn't want to become a director, because if you became a director, you became immediately responsible for targets. He was quite happy doing what he actually wanted to do. So you can, and this comes back to the temporality aspects in terms of if you're 3 levels away, what you're targeting is someone actually has budget and actually has some degree of discretion, because ultimately doing some of the stuff will take maybe months and quarters. You don't want to actually have to report this all the time. So you look for that in terms of the structure. And I'm reminded, basically, you're probably aware that this, when the US basically built this aside, and part of the toolkit was actually they came out with this concept of get charts, and what they used for in that engagement was the get charts was for the upward reporting. That was not used for control downwards. They did something completely different. So the Gantt chart was actually the abstraction between the reporting upper echelons, and down below they actually ran a different process.
Yeah, I think I was thinking at it, which just might be unusual, I'm not sure, but and what I'm thinking about is those upper layers are asking for the transparency down, whereas where we are and what we're doing, we actually don't want to show them quite yet because it's going to confuse them. That's the direction I'm looking. The other direction makes perfect sense to me, right? But that downward, you don't oftentimes get that kind of I want to see transparency outside of the classical reporting lines. We don't even need reports and stuff like dashboards. We're not talking about that. Does that modify anything?
It comes back to basically what can you get away with, quite frankly, I find. If they're trying to push you down, they believe it's a large initiative, and they actually have to have a PMO, and they want to manage everything against targets. It just becomes, a soul-destroying experience, because you're effectively being checked, and it's like, well, did this actually have any relevance to what we actually want in terms of the outcome? And also, basically, it was what we actually assumed or validated at that point in time. And I've got a few grey hairs. My choice these days is basically not to engage in that model.
Yeah, it's game over as far as I'm concerned when that happens.
I think in the Agile community, to this point of transparency, there's some people see transparency as open kimono, and I think that's completely wrong. You don't be transparent about everything. Transparency is a collaboration between you and the other person, and it's a case of, if senior people are asking you questions saying we'd like you to be transparent, say transparent about what? What is the thing that you need to know in order for you to do your job effectively? And I can give you that, but I'm going to open my kimono and show you everything, because it will be too much for you. You'll see things you don't understand, and then you might get involved.
Well, that's what I was getting at with it. Depends on when you're opening your kimono. It makes a big difference.
And part of it is building that relationship of trust, so that rather, if you go from my project is green to the next day it's red, that's not going to build trust. But if you're saying, you know what, we're currently holding it at green, but there are issues, I will let you know if as a result of those issues materializing or those risks materializing, that's going to shift to amber or to red, so that they can ask perhaps more questions, so that they can prepare. And it is giving them the chance. It's not shocking them with information. But certainly, I think the big misunderstanding is that people think transparency means open kimono and that you should display everything. So for a team, for me, a development team within an organization, really the thing that anyone outside should care about is, here's the epic we're working on, and here's how many of the stories we've done. So the cumulative flow diagram to show the stories within that epic. Outside of the team, that's pretty much anyone should need to know, because that tells everyone in terms of how likely they are to hit their deadlines and so on. But what you tend to find is consultancies who don't understand Agile go, right, we're going to the steering committee and we're going to show you the 20 stories that we've got in the sprint this week and whether they got done and what they didn't do and everything. No one cares. You're just giving them the wrong information. So it's building the relationship, and in transparency is a collaboration between the person providing the information and the person receiving the information, so the person receiving it can perform their role. And that's not just up and down the organization, that's across the organization as well.
Because there's also the point really about it's changing the language here and giving them things like CFD and enabling them to start thinking about probability-based delivery models to enable them to have the right conversations. I tried to avoid that when I talked about approaches. I was just talking about largely, the things I'm looking for, which help me orientate and observe and orientate before acting, not the actual specific details around the process. But I do think CFDs are actually a useful tool.
Barbara, you're on mute.
Damn it.
I actually, Barbara, I prefer you on mute. Kidding.
You're my favorite. In the chat, Dave mentioned something about anticipatory triggering in the context of trustworthiness and transparency. I was wondering if you guys could elaborate on that a little bit.
That's why I was pointing out that it's unusual that I'm getting this pressure from above to be transparent, and I don't want to, exactly for the point that Dave is making. So yeah. I would love to jump into that.
It's the old problem of last 2 or 3 decades. People can't handle the implicit unless it's made explicit. Right? And therefore, they don't think about setting up systems that will effectively manage things implicitly with triggers into the explicit when you need it. So we're working on this on project management at the moment, and actually on a big pharma project, which is, how do you trigger executives when they to go and ask questions, not to say something is going wrong or something is going right, but it says you should go and ask some questions here, right? And that's called an anticipatory trigger. And to me, that's key in modern decision support. And it requires human sensor networks and a whole body of other things. Yeah. But transparency is nearly always a bad idea. If you have to talk about it, you're probably going to get it wrong anyway.
There's the other aspect of this is the agile demo, which is sort of being baked into a lot of this. And what I find difficult with that is the fact that developers can't bring the level of abstraction up to support the engagement. So you can't bring senior stakeholders into that because the conversation's too detailed. They just don't have the context and can't engage usefully.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that thing I've been talking about for the last 2 or 3 years, we finally finished putting it together, which is a training course to train users to talk to IT people. Because that's actually part of the problem. Is if you look at the cognitive diversity, it's very difficult for IT people to understand abstract or non-concrete or vague requirements. They just find it very difficult to cope with it, and that's because they're good at what they do. So I think we need to be looking at cognitive diversity. And again, a problem with Agile is this one size fits all. It's like competence models, adult maturity models, all of these attempts to homogenize us into single pathways is actually quite dangerous when we need the diversity.
Yes, I didn't touch on that around the training aspect. I see a lot of people basically just applying standardized training. And the argument I had about this some months ago was that, it's analogous to giving someone the keys to the car and the highway code manual and expecting them to go out and teach themselves how to drive. You've got to take them on the journey around this. And it's got to be tailored to the individual requirements and support them in terms of their development. I do see Maurice Sink's been doing some quite nice stuff with LearnerShape, which is actually applying machine learning in this space, which I think actually has some utility.
Yeah, but doesn't this also get around to some of these questions when we're talking about trustworthiness and transparency and anticipatory triggers in organizations? This also comes around to some of these ideas around epistemic justice in companies, right? Because a lot depends often on who's asking the question, and that can I mean it can expose a lot about the organization, right? Like if the wrong person asks the question, then suddenly this is opened, a big can of worms, and it makes you question some of the information flows within the organization, which is painful.
I've had to change my train times tomorrow because I've got to go and sit with the CEO of one of the world's 5 biggest pharmaceutical companies, because we did a narrative perspective in which nobody knew who was the CEO. And apparently he's in a state of near trauma, so I've been called in to have a chat. Because for the first time he's realized that, he's been putting people under colossal pressure. And it's not direct, but his whole management team believe in working 16 hours a day. So they create a model that everybody else feels they've got to follow. And he just hasn't been aware of it. So.
Yeah, and part of it is that everyone's afraid to share that with him, right? Until you came to the sense-making exercise. And yeah, it's a really interesting question about trustworthiness and transparency, right? Because you have to build the relationship, and that takes time, but violating that relationship is the work of an instant. And this is another problem that organizations often run into. I see Kyle has his hand raised. Kyle.
Hey, thanks for this fascinating conversation. I want to build on what Chris and Jocko were talking about, the abruptness of transparency, because I hear so much about the necessity for disruption and discomfort as a catalyst for change. In execution, what I find much more often is that we do a really good job of segregating what agents are open and adaptive for change, and which ones are going to be more resilient, probably not to change itself, but the method by which we're trying to get to that change, that introduction. And so then everything stalls right there. I'm wondering what that hump is. What if anyone here has experienced that same sort of thing, what you see that hump is and how traversing that works.
You talked about disruption, and what I try and do is talk about the journey. and try and just sort of make it a joint journey. And that's what I talked about earlier, was the micro narratives, really engaging at the team or leadership level and starting to actually get them to actually understand what actually would be relevant. One of the big challenges we had was around release management. They actually hadn't trained release management. The team lead was actually concerned about what we're doing and what it actually meant for her people, because she could actually see that they potentially not actually have a role in the organization. So we actually had to, you work with them to actually understand basically what would actually make sense from their point of view, and try and come up with a narrative that takes them on that journey. I touched on Keegan's immunity to change. People don't. The key thing is people don't necessarily don't like change, but they don't want to die. And you've got to take them. And I see a lot of this with we've been Spotified, we're now agile. Well, what they've done is they've been sheep-dipped. They've actually not actually contextualized what agile means for them and their teams or their groups. There's a great book that talks about cartoons around agile. In the worst case you see is basically they've been Spotified. What actually happens has been no change to the organization. They've just changed the labels. And changing the labels doesn't actually change the behaviors at all. So Dave's point is that don't really go and sort of talk about, well, actually, we need to make this fundamental change. This is direction. What does it mean to you? How can we actually then work through this?
One of the things in the chat, Steve Holt. Steve, are you still here? Steve, are you still here? You mentioned Bryant Walker Smith's work on this idea of certification of trustworthiness. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I hesitate to point out so that Dave won't cringe that this was in a Santa Fe Institute workshop.
Oh dear.
He was a legal professor, professor of law at University of South Carolina, and he was really talking about this really interesting aspect of the whole legal system around certification and safety of a product is based on proving that you've met a series of tests. But when we see the same companies have problem after problem, it calls to mind whether or not we should actually change the entire legal basis and focus on the trustworthiness of the company itself as opposed to the product. And he was using autonomous cars as an example of that, right? As just a test case, not the only one. But do we trust this company to create the sufficiently robust set of algorithms that will lead to safe autonomy? Because you can never prove the software, yes or no. So the question is, do you trust the company? Now, he didn't have the answers, right? But
no, I'll come back. I don't think you can trust the companies, but I was going to use Tesla and basically what they've done about their certification and the way they approach it. I talked about modularization before, and if you look at the Joe Justice stuff, he talks about the fact that they had a problem with the Y and the heat pump. They just switched the heat pump out. They can make that change and they can recertify the vehicle within the course of a matter of hours. Yep. Because they haven't fundamentally changed the interface. They've modularized the architecture of the car to enable them to actually do that. Now, coming back to the AI aspect of it, I think my personal view is Musk has oversold a lot of this stuff. You're starting to get to a stage, and I just saw this in the press today. What they're talking about is the fact that the evidence, it's an evidence-based approach that automated cars are as safe, if not safer, than manually driven cars. And this seems to be where they're actually going. So we're going to get less deaths with an automated car. We're not going to have no deaths.
Right. He did have there's one line I wrote down that was a quote, which I think he kind of summed it up. And he said, if we can't trust you when you call your system full self-driving, then why should we trust you when you say it's safe? And so it confounds marketing mottos, right, with some sort of engineering practical definition.
I would bring that back. The way I started to think about this, Steve, was you've got to actually have some form of government policy around this stuff.
Yep.
And that should be setting the guardrails. And that says, comes back to the headers. You're not just going to let them go out and drive this. You've got to actually have a lot of evidence that says, well, actually, they've tried this, they've tried it in these scenarios. You've got to basically trial it in a wide variety of systems. And therefore, you may actually constrain them and say, well, we can give you the license, you can only use it in this suburb, and you can only do this between certain hours until you've actually seen these additional steps validated. Mm-hmm. And it becomes, it becomes very much a journey, not a black and white situation.
And it seems very much in keeping with what we're talking about here too, about the whole idea of starting where you are today and not just jumping way out in the future.
Yeah.
I mean, with technology, we have seen that the regulation always lags behind. And, earlier I used to think that maybe that needs to change, and maybe it should, but there is a benefit to it that if the regulation comes first before the technology is mature enough, it can strangle the technology, and so, or the technology development. So I guess in this case, in Tesla's case, for example, maybe the regulators might jump in after there is sufficient outrage. And literally, I think all this is really sometimes not just a function of actual scientific things as opposed to public perception. And so I do think regulation will catch up, but they will give it sufficient time before they act.
But you can't take perception out of this. The public perception is very powerful emotion. Yes. And the other aspect around this is I feel that there should be probably a co-evolution. We talk about this from the complexity perspective, the agents and the system co-evolves. And this is maybe one of the things to be thought about from a policy perspective, where you're moving into this sort of stuff. We think about what would actually make sense, and we trial it. And the companies, the market and the policies actually evolve as we go through this. But we do it in such a way, and we apply an appropriate level of transparency to what we're actually doing. I think that's doable, but are we doing that?
Yeah, and in a broader perspective, there's also the question of, what impact does this have on the other parts of the organization, the company, the product line? Because if you prove yourself untrustworthy in one context, for me at least, and for many people that I've worked with, you're untrustworthy in all contexts.
Yes.
And so that, you always have to be cognizant when you're talking about building trust in organizations and things like that. You can't just be trustworthy about this one thing and expect your organization to go along with it or to trust you, even in that thing, because trust is, as I said, it's destroyed, and when it's destroyed absolutely, I think.
I think what I try and do is use come back to the boundaries. Establish the trust within the boundaries, actually understand and socialize that to enable you. Because if you're going outside the boundaries, then you or the group actually has to realize they actually have to build trust around that. It shouldn't necessarily be a transitive dependency, a transitive situation. There should be an explicit acknowledgement that actually outside over here, we can play a little bit on the social capital, but you really want to basically put that on solid grounding as soon as possible.
Dave has put is this a shameless plug, Dave, or are you just like...
Yeah, we've just launched a pulse on trust, which has actually sold quite well in its first week. So that's, we're building some body of stuff on that.
Good, yes.
But I thought I'd confess up front I was selling.
I appreciate that. I appreciate your transparency, Dave. Are there any other questions from the floor? Because I could talk to these guys all day, but I don't really think you want me to do that. Anyone? Well, for now, I will say thank you very much, Greg. This has been wonderful. can you tell us where they can find your work in general? You have a Medium channel. Where's the best place to find your work?
I don't tend to publish this very much. It's one of the things I'm rather poor at. Some of that is because of basically NDAs. Some of the stuff I've been doing for one of the telcos did actually get published. They did actually meet the schedule and did actually make the statements to the market. So, but still, I can't really talk about the details around this. So it's more a case if you're interested in sort of some stuff, just reach out to me. I'm happy to have a chat anytime.
Okay, and you're on all the socials. He's at Sailing Greg on Twitter. He's on LinkedIn. You can find him. Well, on that note, I will say thank you, Greg. Please come back anytime. This was awesome. Thank you to all of you for hanging with us. Let's give Greg a round of applause, virtual or otherwise.
Thank you. It's been good.
And thank you so much, and we'll see all of you soon.
Thanks again. Cheers.